Tonight we are here, in part, to celebrate a truly wonderful series of books, the Penguin Lives series of biographies. As a child, I had a wonderful series of brief biographies of great famous men and a few famous women. And I cherished that series. For some reason, I'm no longer in possession of that series. I'll have to talk to my mother about that. But they were marvelous books. I can still picture them on my shelf. Jumping directly from Davy Crockett to Marie Curie in that wonderful fashion that those series did. And for us adults, the Penguin Lives series has really, at least for me, brought back a truly nostalgic feel. Tonight we are celebrating the publication of the two latest editions in this marvelous series. And the first of our speakers tonight is Dr. Sherwin B. Newland, who has written a marvelous biography of Leonardo da Vinci. And I think the highest praise that I can extend to this book is that he brings to it a real passion for inquiry and a love of science that I think his subject would have recognized and appreciated wholeheartedly. Sherwin Newland is the author of the best-selling How We Die, which won the 1994 National Book Award for Nonfiction, as well as The Mysteries Within, A Surgeon Reflects on Medical Myth, Doctors, The Biography of Medicine, and The Wisdom of the Body, published in paperback as How We Live. He is the clinical professor of surgery at Yale University, where he also teaches medical history and bioethics. And he has come to us tonight from Hamden, Connecticut, and we are extremely pleased and honored that he could do so. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sherwin Newland.
I'm so sorry.
I'm actually Davy Crockett, here to talk to you about Marie Curie. You know, I love being in Cambridge because it's so much like New Haven, but without the crime. I think without the crime. The history of my being interested in Leonardo may surprise many people. What may surprise really many people is that Leonardo, beyond being an artist and all the other things that he was primarily an anatomist. And when I say primarily, I really mean primarily. It's my notion, as I've been studying his life for the last 25 years, that what he really wanted to be was a scientist and not a painter. And of course, he never was a sculptor, but not an architect and not a city planner. But he wanted to be the first great anatomist, and indeed he was. And I hope I can convince you of that in the next 20 minutes or so. Probably the most remembered thing that's ever been said about Leonardo da Vinci is this statement that Sigmund Freud made in the early part of the century. He was like a man who awoke early in the darkness while all others were still asleep. Now that's familiar to many of you, but there is something else that he said that someone else said, Walter Pater actually, that I think is more cogent and more to the point about the Leonardo that I have come to know over this period of time. Pater, who was the great late 19th century critic, essayist, said this: "He seemed to those about him as one listening to a voice that was silent for other men. He seemed to his contemporaries to be the possessor of some unsanctified and secret wisdom." It's this watchful intensity that's conveyed by the life of Leonardo that's captured my imagination. And that word specifically, unsanctified. Leonardo was probably the first of the great Western thinkers during the Middle Ages, Renaissance, as a matter of fact, to separate God from nature, not to seek the answers in God's hand, but to seek the answers in ways that any human being with enough sense, with enough willingness to work, could find out for himself. We don't even know what Leonardo believed in. In his time, he was thought perhaps to be a heretic or whatever it was, but it was his belief that if he worked hard enough, everything would be available to him. We don't know much more about him than that. it's astonishing how much we talk about this man, how much we write about him, and how few facts we have. And let me give you an example of this. And this is the way really I start the book. In the 8th year of my idolatrous fascination with this fellow, I decided, finding myself in Florence one day on a trip with my wife, I decided I'd like to go visit Vinci because I wanted to be at the great man's birthplace. So I went to a local natural history museum and I asked how to get there. So I got on a train to Empoli and then I got on the bus to Vinci. And you get off the bus in Vinci and there are these huge signs with arrows. And the signs say, Casa di Natale de Leonardo, the arrow is this way. Of course, the arrow should be this way because it's 3 kilometers straight up in the air. So we start walking up this hill, and we trudge, and we trudge, and we trudge, and we come to the top of it, and there's this old Renaissance ruin with 2 old Italian ladies selling postcards. And some other tourists sort of kind of hanging around languidly, and what an anticlimax it was. What an essential waste of time it was. We didn't feel any sense of enchantment. It didn't feel right. And there was a reason that it didn't feel right. It was a tourist trap. And I didn't find out for years that no one knows where this fellow was born. We don't even know if he was born in Vinci. We knew his father lived in Vinci, but he may not have been born there. In fact, we had walked out of Vinci into another town called Anciano, which is the town beyond Vinci. Some people think he was born there. And that, to me, is a kind of a metaphor for trying to find this person who one of his biographers has called. See, I almost said autobiographers because when we write about Leonardo, we write about ourselves. You know, everybody has a take on him, tells you more about himself than he does about Leonardo, which is what Leonardo incidentally did in the Mona Lisa, but we'll get to that later. So here's what I write about my experience that day. Leonardo was not to be found in that place. In fact, he's not to be found in any place. He's not a creature of places or monuments or even of permanence. He flashed across his time and was gone, leaving a vast body of work, almost none of which, except the paintings, could be fully appreciated until centuries after his death and far away from the house in which he was almost certainly not born. But it's his anatomy. It's not his life. It's not his study of the perspective of the eye. It's not really the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper that has kept me attracted to this man as a surgeon, obviously. But it's the fact that almost from the beginning of his career, his objective was to study nature using the human body as the medium by which he could understand even the celestial bodies, because to him, the human body was the microcosm. It was the distilled essence of the entire universe, the macrocosm. And if he could understand the body and the way it worked and why it worked, he would understand everything, including whatever it was that he conceived of as the divinity. Not only is it the anatomy of Leonardo that has obsessed me, but his elusiveness as well. Struggling to the top of a steep hill in Vinci or Anciano and finding nothing more than a perhaps seems symbolic of the problem faced not only by the professional Leonardo scholars, but by the rest of us as well, struggling to comprehend who he was. The dates, the facts, the known events are far fewer than we need if we're to understand how such a being could have existed. The enigma of the Mona Lisa's smile is not less than the enigma of her creator's life force. Or perhaps that smile is in itself Leonardo's ultimate message to the ages. And here I put words in his mouth, but I think these words are justified. There is even more to me than you can ever capture. Though I've spoken so intimately to you in my notebooks, even as I have spoken to myself, I have kept final counsel only with the depths of my spirit and the inscrutable source that has made me possible. Seek as you may, I will commune with you only so far. The rest is withheld, for it was my destiny to know things you will never know. And the more one studies Leonardo, the more one comes away with this perception that we will never understand him, but we ought to keep trying because it's enormous fun, if nothing else. My take on Leonardo is so different than the take of so many people who have examined the few known facts of his life. Was he even a Renaissance man? People think of him as the ultimate Renaissance man. You know, today you read about a baseball player who's a gourmet cook, so they say, oh, he's a Renaissance man. Or a physics professor who plays the violin, a Renaissance man. Well, listen, here's a guy who was a painter, an architect, an engineer, a philosopher, a mathematician, a scientist, an interior designer, a city planner, and, of course, an anatomist. I say he may not have been such a Renaissance man because, in fact, when we think of what the Renaissance represented, a return to the classics, a return to the classical period, and a love of nature. It was only the love of nature. As a matter of fact, he knew very little about the classics. He was what he called himself, an unlettered man. Here's what he wrote. Those who study the ancients and not the works of nature are stepsons and not sons of nature, which is the mother of all good authors. And he specifically included the Aristotles, the Ptolemies, the Galens, the great sine qua non of medicine at that time. He was born illegitimately. His father was about the 5th generation of notaries. They were very prosperous people. His mother was a girl of the town. The town was Vinci, indeed. She apparently could have lived in Vinci or Ancillana, where he was born. Nobody knows much about the first 5 years of his life. He appears, the date of his birth appears in a notary's register written by his grandfather, in fact, and 5 years later it is noted that there is an illegitimate child living with the family of Ser Piero da Vinci in Vinci. So at least at age 5 he was in his father's house, and his father apprenticed him eventually to a great artist of the time whose nickname was Verrocchio, meaning true eye. Verrocchio was an artisan. He did all kinds of commissions in metalwork, painting, whatever. Leonardo stayed with him till he was 25 or 26 years old, and from then on, he was on his own. First 5 years in Florence on his own, and the rest of his life is peripatetic, although he stayed in different cities for different periods of time. Milan initially for about 16 years, then Florence, then Rome, then back to Milan, then back to Florence again, back to Rome again, and eventually dying, as many of you know, in the small French city of Amboise. Always moving when things got bad, when the money supply ran out, when the ruler, let's say the Duke of Milan, so-called Ludovico Sforza, was attacked by enemies, and Leonardo, he was Leonardo's patron. Leonardo realized he had no money. He did not stay with the Duke in his bad times. He went back off to Florence. And you would think that this might be a condemnation of his memory, and the fact is that Leonardo's only reason for living was to be Leonardo. That's all he wanted. He attached himself to the Borgias, to the Medicis, to some of the most vicious and violent people of the time. Nobody was worse than Cesare Borgia. He became Cesare Borgia's military engineer at one point, accompanying him on all the maraudings and slayings and murderings, just so that he could be free to get back to the hospital to dissect corpses. The few lovely paintings we have of his were accepted as commissions, believe it or not, and I'm convinced of this, so that he could have the money to get back to the hospital and dissect the corpses. As he got older, there was more and more dissection. He started dissecting when he was about 21 or 22, because Verrocchio said, if you want to understand the way the human body works, you've got to go dissect corpses in the hospital. And that was his initial motivation. But as time went on, he thought, why does the muscle work this way? What's going on inside that, for example, makes me feel noises or makes my heart go tipper-tapper? Ooh, I like that, tipper-tapper. Anyway, so he became the very first man in all of history to dissect within the body with the purpose of finding out anything about the body. I have a couple of wonderful pictures in this book showing the anatomy drawing that was in every student's textbook. There was one textbook that every European medical student used, in which the anatomy is simply symbolic. They didn't care what the anatomy was. Everybody got sick because of their black bile, their yellow bile, their phlegm, their blood was out of whack or something. Who cared if there was a spleen or a liver or a gallbladder? But Leonardo cared. And suddenly he appears with an almost perfect anatomical drawing of the entire body, which he created in time because he was not content to know and learn only about the function, the structure rather. It was the function. It was why things work. It was his idea that what one must do in art is to capture a single instant of time, and in that single instant portray what he called the passions of the soul. It's a term that he's used several times in his writing. During that first Milan period, he painted The Last Supper, which some of you have probably seen. It's now been restored. The moment in time represented by The Last Supper is the moment after Jesus has said to those 12 men, "One of you will betray me." And every one of those faces is different. And every one of those faces is thinking something completely different. And now that it's restored, you can almost tell what they're thinking, what each of those people is thinking. He was intrigued by function. He was intrigued by energy. He was intrigued by movement and forces, and the epitome of all of this was flowing water. Flowing water to him symbolized the movement of the body, the movement of thought, and the passions of the soul. Leonardo was intrigued by motion and the forces involved. The continuous flowings of energies in nature and in the life of man are a constant and even a central theme running through his manuscripts, like the streamings of waters to which he so often alluded. Moving water, in fact, is his symbol for those flowing energies. It is vital to his conception of the universe. To him, the study of structure was only the beginning of the study of function and the mechanical forces that made it possible. He developed further a notion he had long held about the pictorial and scientific capture of a single instant, wherein the whole of an event or person is elucidated. Both in art and in science, he argued, one should arrest that instant and examine it because it holds within itself the past and the future, just as it is a thing of the veriest present. In which a breathing instant and a composure for all time are held in suspension. He has this image that he comes back to again and again. You put your hand in a stream of water, and everything on one side of your hand is the past, and everything on the other side of your hand is the future. And the place where your hand is that instant that you're trying to capture. And the more one looks at the Mona Lisa, the more one recognizes he has captured an instant in her life. Or is it her life? Who was she? Who is in that picture? Is it indeed this woman, Mona Lisa, whose name has been carried down through the ages? She's a 24-year-old wife of a man in his late 30s who was a nobleman of the time. It was one of many, many commissions Leonardo took, and of course one of the few that he ever finished, because what he used to do was take these many commissions, begin work and stop work. And people would get so fed up with him they wouldn't even ask for their money back. So what would happen would be he would pocket the money. He never did the work. He wasn't trying to cheat anybody. He just wanted to get back to his anatomical work. For example, at the time he was painting The Last Supper, there he is in Milan, he has met a 100-year-old man. And they get to be kind of friendly, and one day the 100-year-old man drops dead. He's living in a hospital. That was before HMOs. You could live in a hospital. And he said, I'm going to dissect this 100-year-old man's body. And by coincidence, what happens is that a few months later, a baby of 2 years dies, and he dissects that body. And he's struck by a difference which to us, of course, would be very obvious, but to people at that time would be anything but obvious. The old man's arteries are hard as rocks. They're twisted and they're bent. You can't get water through them. And Leonardo starts to think, why is it so different from these arteries in the baby, which are straight, which are soft? I can blow water through them. It's perfectly fine. And the answer comes to him as the answer to another question he's been wondering about. Why do old people die without fever? Now, this is a time when the average life expectancy was about 38, 37 years of age. And what did they die of? They all died of infectious disease. So everybody died of a fever. But the few people who would live into their 60s, 70s, 80s would not die of fever. They would die of things that we recognize as stroke, heart disease, perhaps dementia. This is the answer. He says what happens is that the blood can't get through to the various organs, particularly to the heart, because he had discovered the coronary arteries 100 years before anybody thought of it. He discovered the coronary arteries and realized that blood was not getting to the heart. So these organs are dying, and that's why old people die without fever. But that wasn't enough for Leonardo. He had to know why it happened. He didn't know about DNA and telomerase and all that sort of stuff. Why do these arteries get thickened? There must be something in the blood. There must be something in the blood that comes out of the blood and deposits on the inside of the arteries. This is 1492, Columbus is sailing along. That's a long time ago. What is it that comes out of the arteries, that comes out of the blood that deposits on the artery? It's something we eat. It's something in this rich diet of ours. Here's a man talking about cholesterol. More than 400 years before anybody even knows how to spell the word. This is typical of what he did. I can't go into the details of a particular discovery he made about the aortic valve, the valve just above the heart, but it wasn't rediscovered until 1969, and Leonardo had identified it in about 1502 or 1503. His life story is full of things like this, and he wrote them down, wrote these facts down amidst these thousands of drawings that he made with his left hand. There are approximately 15,000 manuscript pages, of which we only have 5,000. The rest have disappeared. We don't know where they are. Every once in a while, something turns up. The Madrid Codex was found in a library in Spain in 1965. We will probably not find any others. All the anatomical work was put into a single box about the time of Charles I of England. It was locked. Someone cut Charles I's head off, as you remember. People forgot about the box. 150 years later, someone chopped it open, and there are all of Leonardo's drawings, which people have been studying ever since. What is this writing? What is mirror writing? If there are any lefties in this place, you can do it very easily. It's the natural way for a lefty to write, lefty to inscribe, I should say. He had his own way of writing words. We all have our own ways of keeping notes. You have to remember to buy a pitcher of beer. So you don't write pitcher of beer, you write pit B or something like that. You have a code for yourself. He had a code for himself. There was nothing mysterious about it. His words would run together. Sometimes a long word would be divided into three. He used no punctuation. He used mirror writing, and numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 he made up. He had different kinds of orthography than our ordinary Arabic numerals. But anybody who studies it can read it, and a good number of people have read it and taught us about it. Let me just read a paragraph about the notebooks. Had Leonardo set out to record a volume of the principles by which he lived his life, or a book of aphorisms for which he wished to be remembered, or a compendium of his interpretations of the universe and its relationship to mankind, had any of these been his intention, he could not have accomplished them more effectively than what he did in what would appear to be a scattershot miscellany of random thoughts sprayed over the pages of his loose sheets and notebooks amid sketches, architectural plans, scientific observations, mathematical constructs, quotations from other authors, and records of daily life. He exposes at once his innermost musings and the overt thrust of the message he devoted his life to transmitting. That a human being, and this is the message, that a human being can be understood only by turning toward nature. That the secrets of nature are discoverable by observation and experiment, free of preconception. That there are no bounds to the possibilities of man's understanding. That there is a unity between all elements in the universe. That the study of form is essential, but the key to understanding lies in the study of movement and function. That the dynamics of nature are what is important, that the ultimate question to be answered about all life, and indeed all nature, is not how, but why. The great difference in the few paintings of Leonardo and the many paintings of Michelangelo is that Leonardo was attempting to show you what his subjects were thinking. We can't figure it out, but that's what he was attempting to do. Michelangelo wanted to show you how they were moving. This is most epitomized in the Mona Lisa, who has, like Leonardo himself, eluded our perceptions for these many, many years. Who is she? Everybody agrees she is a maternal figure. There's a lot of psychoanalytic interpretation, obviously based on his relationship with his two mothers, his real mother and the woman who brought him up, who was his father's wife, Albiera, his father's first wife. But I think it's more than that. You know, one of the psychoanalytic, I should say, interpretation of homosexuality is that the young boy, for a complex of reasons, begins to identify with his mother. Freud was quite clear in saying that there are biological reasons too, and he didn't want to deny or gainsay the biological reasons, but as he studied his homosexual patients, the identification with the mother was very, very clear. And his thesis was that not only does the child identify with the mother, but the love for the mother is extreme. So he is basically in adoration, not just of his mother, but since he identifies with his mother, of himself too. This gives rise to enormous narcissism. And he actually Freud has not use the narcissism to explain Mona Lisa, but I have tried to do that, to try to tell who this person is that he has become so renowned for painting. My notion is that just as this woman is his mother, this woman is also Leonardo. And the interesting thing is that more than one writer who has written biography has pointed out that whatever a biographer may do, whether he gives you an accurate portrait or she gives you an accurate portrait of the subject or not, what they really do is give you an accurate portrait of themselves. So my argument is that Leonardo, in painting the Mona Lisa, was giving us a biography and an autobiography at the same time. But the audience is too hushed, so I have to amuse you. And I want to read you something from Leonardo's Anatomy, which I think will amuse you, and then I can turn the evening over to Nigel Nicholson. He had many fascinating notions about anatomy that turned out to be right, that were not rediscovered for years and years. But there was a fascination he had, as you can imagine, with sex organs. He was revolted by the notion of sexuality in general. There is no evidence from writings about him that he had any sexual experiences of any kind. He was surrounded at all times by beautiful young boys and young men. He kept them in his household. He supported them, but apparently there was no real relationship with them. The notion is that his libido was repressed and suppressed into what Freud calls the investigative impulse, that is the secret of his great productivity. We all sublimate our libidos to some extent, and this is why we can do the things we do. His libido was said by many psychoanalytic observers to be completely suppressed into the investigative impulse. So he was revolted by the sexual act, but he was fascinated by the sexual organs. Not unexpectedly, he was more fascinated by the male sexual organs than by the female, which in some ways repelled him. And he writes this little screed about how awful sexual activity is. If it weren't for the elevated emotions involved, the physical act would be too disgusting for anybody to carry out. And then very shortly thereafter, he writes this about the penis. About the penis. He starts off about the penis. You don't need Leonardo to tell you this, but I'd like you to hear it in his words. The penis, this confers with a human intelligence and sometimes has intelligence of itself. And although the will of the man desires to stimulate it, it remains obstinate and takes its own course. And moving sometimes of itself without license or thought by the man, whether he be sleeping or waking, it does what it desires. Often the man is asleep, and it is awake. And many times the man is awake, and it is asleep. Many times the man wishes it to practice, and it does not wish to. Many times it wishes to, and the man forbids it. It seems, therefore, that this creature has often a life and intelligence separate from man, and it would appear that the man is in the wrong in being ashamed to give it a name or exhibit it. Now, listen to the rest of this. Here's a man who is revolted by sexuality, ashamed to give it a name or exhibit it, seeking rather constantly to cover and conceal what he ought to adorn and display with ceremony as one who serves. So the great man is human as the rest of us. I suspect that most of the enjoyment of this evening is to come. So I just... Oh, that was not a pun. I swear it was not a pun. And this is Boston. I just want to leave you... Oh, I'm so ashamed. I just want to leave you with one thought, and it goes back to Pater. It goes back to Walter Pater in perhaps 1880 or whenever it was he wrote this. It's got to do with that watchful intensity. Leonardo, the great student of the eye. Leonardo, the great student of perspective. Leonardo, the great visual student of anatomy. The watchful intensity that enabled him to develop anatomically, scientifically, through the years, and he was, as Walter Pater called him, the possessor of some unsanctified and secret wisdom. Thanks very much for hearing me out.
Oh, just wants to have a reading that doesn't get back to the penis. Okay, we'll regroup. Fortunately, hopefully, time permitting, we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions of Dr. Newland. He does have a commitment back in New Haven later this evening, so we will hope for the best. Okay. What an evening. It is remarkable to have with us tonight two such distinguished guests, such a surfeit. I think that only one other author in the Penguin Lives series has had the distinction of knowing their subject, and I believe that was Douglas Brinkley, who wrote about Rosa Parks. But remarkably, our second guest tonight, Nigel Nicholson, knew as a young child and as a young man Virginia Woolf, and it is that knowledge that lends such a remarkable personal quality to this biography, and allows him, I think, to so effectively evoke not only the life and the sensibility of Virginia Woolf, but of her time. Nigel Nicholson is the author of A Portrait of a Marriage, a biography of his parents, Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville West, and of Long Life, which are his own memoirs. He's also written books on politics and the arts, and the Whitbread Prize-winning History of Mary Curzon. A member of Parliament for several years, he's the co-founder of Wiedenfeld and Nicholson Publishers. And he has come to us tonight from Sissinghurst in England, which is now a National Trust property. And we are extremely honored and pleased that he could join us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Nigel Nicholson.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must first of all apologize to you for my late arrival. We had left 1 hour to be here from another part of Boston, but it took an hour and a half. And I pity you if this congestion occurs every night. But I can assure you that it's far worse in London, and that your people are infinitely more courteous. No honking, no shouting, no cutting in. People behaved with exemplary courtesy. And that did something to mitigate my distress at being late for you. And I'm very well aware that later this evening there will be competition to any event like this. And so promise not to exceed 15 minutes and to release you to hear something much more important than what I have to say. But Dr. Newland and I have each contributed to this series of short books, each of us on a genius. And I concede that his genius was more of a genius than my genius, because there's never been a man, really, in all history who has accomplished more than Leonardo. But the shortness of our books doesn't in any way, I hope you will come to agree, diminish their interest or importance. They are of a length which you can read happily in a lonely evening or on a long flight. And when you consider that in the Boston Globe and other national newspapers here, obituaries appear every day almost, 1,000 words long, from which you can gather the significance and importance of a person's life. Well, our books are 50 times longer. But in writing about Virginia Woolf, I had a particular, an unfair advantage perhaps, because apart from Quentin Bell, who wrote the first life of his aunt, as she was, I am probably the only biographer of this woman who knew her personally. I knew her simply because she became the intimate friend of my mother, Vita Sackville-West. And in my childhood, she was a frequent visitor. And we greeted her visits with delight. Oh, good, Virginia's coming back again. What fun. And when she came, she would interrogate us about the simple details of our boyhood lives. She would say, "What woke you up this morning?" Well, it was the sun coming through our window. What sort of a sun? Angry sun? Friendly sun? And then we had to go through the whole process of dressing. Which sock did you put on first, the right or the left? And then breakfast, and so on, until we came into the room and found her there. It was a sort of, she was gathering copy, I think, in a sort of way, as all novelists do, particularly about childhood, which to Virginia Woolf was a sort of strange experience. Children are eccentrics. They talk strangely, they do odd things, and so they're very interesting. And secondly, I think she was teaching us boys, my brother and myself, a lesson: to observe and to record what we observe in writing. She once said to me, "Nothing has really happened until it's been described." And another saying of hers I remember so well is when she said, "If you don't record fleeting ideas, you will soon cease to have any." And she meant, in fact, said that we must keep a diary. We must write letters to our friends in order to practice what she was preaching, the putting on paper, in words, our daily experiences, which of course is something that she always did herself. Well, she's not just famous for talking to little boys. She's famous as a novelist. She wrote 8 or 9 novels, many of which have become classics in our time, some of which, particularly her masterpiece, The Waves, difficult for us to comprehend, requiring more effort sometimes from the reader as they did from the author. But she's also famous for 2 books that she wrote, non-fiction books, in which she advocated the cause of women. They were called A Room of One's Own and 3 Guineas. And A Room of One's Own in particular is put into the hands, so I'm told, of every student in every university of the United States. It has become the Bible of the feminist movement. And we in Britain are flattered by this attention to our author, but rather surprised. Our Virginia has become your Woolf, and are not the same person. Virginia Woolf to us was, of course, a novelist of particular genius. Nobody denies that. But in her more political writings about feminism and about war and the attitude of men generally, we feel that she overstepped the mark. She used to say, I have very many men friends, but men in the mass are awful. Why? What did she mean by that? Why did she dislike us so much? Well, quite innocent people. She meant that when men get together in an army, in a school, in a university, as judges or people who preach in court, or even in church, all the worst characteristics of men come to the surface. They become arrogant. They delight in their uniforms, their robes, their wigs even. And they exclude women from their activities. Well, now, of course, that has been true for a very large period of history, until possibly the beginning of the 20th century. The women were disgracefully excluded. And Virginia Woolf set herself to contest this tradition. Of course, and this was one failing that we see in her argument, she was only talking about people like herself, that very, very small group of women in the upper middle classes who came from cultural homes. She wanted them to be able to do things that men did, not fight battles, but at least to enter the professions, to be doctors, to be teachers. But there was a limit even to what she wanted to see women doing. There was a woman who was a great friend of my own family and known well to Virginia Woolf, but unknown to most people. Her name was Hilda Matheson, and she became the first talks director of the BBC. She was brilliant at her job. She had to invent an entirely new technique. This was in the late 20s and 30s. And she managed to persuade the most eminent intellectuals of the day, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, Bertrand Russell, Virginia Woolf, to take part in the programs of talks which she initiated. But Virginia, in spite of agreeing to contribute, saw something in Hilda's pushiness, as she described it, her ambition, something distasteful. She thought she was hard when she wasn't. She thought that her ambition was extraordinarily unworthy. She said to my mother, whose great friend Hilda Matheson was, "How can you consort with somebody of that nature?" And so my conclusion is that she hadn't really thought through her advocacy of women's rights. She wasn't interested, of course, in anybody below her own level. Hilda was at her level, but people below didn't really count in her estimation, or didn't figure in her ambition for women's rights. She never thought that a woman whose business it was to clean another woman's house should by her own efforts rise to become a woman for whom other women cleaned. She never thought really that a secretary in an office might, again by her own abilities, become a director of the firm for which she worked. She wasn't interested in that. She was interested only in the higher echelons of the professions. So that is one thing which we in England find wanting in Virginia's arguments. And another is her attitude to pacifism and war. Of course, she thought that wars were generated entirely by men. Indeed, they are to a great extent and fought by men, and that if countries had been ruled by women, there would have been no wars. But it's not true, is it? From Helen of Troy to Margaret Thatcher, women have used war as an instrument of policy. In the World War I, it wasn't men who handed to those they thought were malingering white feathers, but women who did so. Women who admired the courage exhibited by men in combat and despised the coward. Now, this is no criticism of women, but it is a criticism of Virginia, I think, that she overstated the argument. She said in this last second book, which one could call semi-political, 3 Guineas, that she felt that she had no duty to her country because her country had done nothing for her. Can that be true? She thought that any element of patriotism was sentimental and wrong, masculine. But when it came to war in 1939, she found herself with this dilemma that we were engaged in combating something which she considered fundamentally evil. But how could you combat it except by fighting it? She said to her husband Leonard, when war broke out, "Isn't this terrible?" We all said that. And Leonard replied, "Of course it's terrible, but now that it's begun, we better win it." And Virginia, like other pacifists, of course, had no true answer to that. And slowly she changed her mind as the war progressed. Remember, she died only in 1941, so there wasn't very much of a war for her to experience. But she did feel almost, I suppose, for the first time, a stirring of that patriotism, of wishing our side to win. She felt almost, for the first time, admiration for a politician, Winston Churchill. And there was a great moment which she recorded in her diaries when she walked out from her house in Sussex onto the Downs on a lovely summer's afternoon in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. and overhead streamed a flight of Spitfires of the RAF in order to combat over the English Channel an incoming flight of Messerschmitts of the German Luftwaffe. And she said in her diary, looking up at the Spitfires, "I couldn't help but wish them luck." Now that was a turning point, surely. And it is so sad that she only had another year to live. Let me conclude by saying something about her death. She drowned herself in the river near that same house in Sussex. She wrote a letter to her husband Leonard, which is in my book, which I think is one of the most moving letters that any woman has ever penned to a man, saying that she felt that she might go mad again, and how she didn't want to ruin his life. She was too much trouble to him. He couldn't work, she said. And so she felt that this action she was about to take was the kindest and most suitable end. And there was that element of it. She felt that she was going mad again. She could hear voices. But when she did commit suicide, she was not mad. The coroner's verdict was she killed herself while her mind was out of balance. But it wasn't true. She was perfectly sane. So could there have been another reason? Well, I edited Virginia Woolf's letters in 6 volumes, about 15, 20 years ago now. And I had a collaborator, a fellow editor, who was an American woman, Joanne Troutman. And she and I sat over these suicide letters, the last that we'd come to after reading and editing 4,000, and puzzled on this question. Was there any other reason? Of course, there were superficial ones, the strain of the war and the inadequacy of the current diet at the time, but it wasn't that. It was that she felt that she had lost her gift for writing. Her last book was Between the Acts, and it was published after her death. But she told her husband and her doctor that she felt that it was so inferior to what she'd done before. Such a trivial book, such a silly book. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a wonderful book. There was no point really in going on living, or no point in the life which she couldn't describe. And so she decided to kill herself. Well, of course, it was a terrible blow to everybody. We felt that we had lost a woman of extraordinary genius, a woman who may have committed some unkindnesses during her life, but then geniuses are not always kind. And she left behind her such a mass of documentation in her letters and her diaries and her memoirs, in other people's memoirs, and in biographies to which I've made a small contribution myself, which bring her into sharp focus before us. A woman not only of a splendid mentality and courage, but of infinite worth. Thank you.
We'll be happy to take some questions now.
You will, I will repeat.
Indeed, yes. Yes, Dr. Gillen, if you'd like to come up as well. In the back.
Okay. What was the effect of her suicide on you?
What was the effect of Virginia's suicide on you?
Well, of course, I was 21 years old, and I was in the army myself. I hadn't seen her for about a year, and it was the effect upon my mother, who was her most intimate friend, far more than on my mother's sons, because by that time we were occupied with the war itself in our own careers, in a way. And I suppose that when I first heard of this, but I don't remember the occasion when I heard of it, it must have come as a very great shock. But I wasn't then in the position really to speculate upon the reasons for it.
My understanding is that Virginia Woolf was depressed almost always at the conclusion of a major work, such as a novel, and that she frequently felt that the novel she had just completed was not particularly worthwhile, and she always gave it to her husband for a response that was evaluation. Was this different from those other times?
Someone that notes that Virginia Woolf often felt depressed at the closure of a novel when she had finished work on a novel. She's wondering if this suicide marked, or this last period of depression marked, a particularly profound period of depression.
Might have affected her suicide. I explained when I was talking the profound effect of her writing between the acts was upon her mentality. And I think otherwise her novels really had little effect upon her mind. You remember that although in early youth, in childhood in fact, she had been insane, there was a whole period of 25, I think 30 years in her middle life when she had no attack of insanity at all. And she wrote these novels, like To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, The Ways, The Years, and so on, in no way at all affected by what she'd gone through. She does describe it once in Mrs. Dalloway, in which occurs a figure who does go off his head. And there must be some connection between her own experience and what she wrote about him.
What a pair the two of you have written about. It's really extraordinary, Da Vinci and Woolf. I was wondering about Da Vinci. I remember T.J. Clark describing him as a militant and disgusted vegetarian, which was a phrase that I liked very much. I was really wondering whether you thought that Da Vinci had a reverence for life, or was it really more of a fascination with how things worked? And if he was a vegetarian, what were his reasons?
Well, he was a vegetarian because of his reverence for life. Actually, the only speck of anything that might be thought of as religiosity or faith in him is the reverence for life as it represents the work of the Creator. Other than that, there is absolutely nothing. He was a vegetarian for that reason. He would not kill any animal. Once in the entire 5,000 manuscript pages that we have, there's an example of him pithing a frog to study the nervous system, and a very sophisticated study it was. If he had been willing to kill animals or vivisect them, dissect them while they were alive, he would have discovered peristalsis, the movement of the intestine. He missed that completely. He thought that food was passed along the intestinal tract by the pressure of the gas above, and he thought the appendix, which incidentally he discovered, was a pop-off valve for the gas. Yeah. So he was prevented by his reverence for life from finding out something about life he would otherwise have discovered.
This may not be fair, but I wonder if Dr.
I'm a surgeon, I'm used to unfair.
Dr. Newland can answer a question raised by Mr. Nicholson.
Can we make it the other way around?
Somebody referred to Virginia Woolf's depression, and Mr. Nicholson refers to her madness. It's now 50 years later. I've always been curious to know if there's any kind of clinical diagnosis for her mental disorder.
Wondering if at this point we have a clinical diagnosis for the disorder that Virginia Woolf suffered from.
She did, of course, have doctors. But given the state of the science of mental disturbance in those days, she got no help from any of them because they didn't know what was wrong with her and how to cure it. Dr. Newland can speak much more authoritatively about this than I can, but I would have thought that if she'd been alive today, she would have had help, wouldn't she? And perhaps cured of her traumas.
Psychotic people usually do not commit suicide. It's people who are severely neurotically depressed who commit suicide. And my first act tomorrow morning will be to begin Nigel Nicholson's book, which I hope to have finished by noontime, and maybe I can come back and answer the question. But it's always been my impression that what she had was episodes of severe neurotic depression, and she was not, in fact, mad. And anybody in this audience who has ever had depression, as I have, as a matter of fact, and recovered from it, knows that the first premonitory signs bring back memories that are inconceivable to anyone who is not depressed. And I'm going to guess that she was beginning to feel the first premonitory signs was in her perfect right mind, but couldn't tolerate the possibility of going through this one more time. And I'm fascinated by the notion that she became depressed after a novel or a book. Any of us who have written a book know what postpartum depression is. And I suspect that was a major factor, and I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Right.
Well, Dr. Newland speculates that it was something like postpartum depression when Virginia
Yes.
Woolf would finish a novel.
Well, I accept your judgment.
No. And yet, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Maybe our fine speakers would contemplate how Virginia Woolf and Leonardo da Vinci would have got along if they'd met each other.
The gentleman wonders how Virginia Woolf and Leonardo da Vinci.
Well, she once met Einstein, and she told me this. She was introduced to him, and she didn't know what to say, you see. None of us would. What do you say to Einstein? So she thought up something, and she said, "Professor, were you good at sums at school, or did it come later?" And she told me that he just turned away with boredom and contempt. Well, I think that probably it might have been the same with Leonardo, that she wouldn't really have had a great deal in common with him. Because am I right in saying that with all his very many gifts and skills, he wasn't really a writer, was he?
He was a magnificent writer. This was the most extraordinary thing about him, and obviously it sounds like we're peddling
Yes.
books, but you must read this book to read examples of his writing. Oh, do you know what you get with the book? Do you know that picture on the front of the book? Do you know who drew that picture of Leonardo da Vinci? Leonardo da Vinci. It is a self-portrait. In answer to my part of the question, and I have to catch a train, so I'm leaving in a minute, right, Sam? I would say that in all of Leonardo's writings, there is almost no mention of women at all. He had no truck with women. He had no use for women. He lived a completely male life. It's fascinating to notice his absolute captivation by the female genitalia, by the uterus, by the development of the womb. And many commentators about his life have talked about the two poles, which they call attraction and repulsion. And again we have examples of that which attracted him so much, repelling him at the same time. And this is not the time or the place to talk psychoanalytic talk, but it's one of the many reasons that the psychoanalysts are convinced that his homosexuality was indeed and the need to repress libido was indeed the reason for his great achievements, in addition, obviously, to the intellect. And on that note, I'm going to catch the 8:05 to New Haven and hope I don't get mugged at the station. Thank you very much.
Are you going off now? Face, honey, we haven't been able to talk.
Maybe we'll write another book.
But perhaps we could take a question or two more. Yes, please.
Mr. Nicholson, could you comment on Virginia Woolf's marriage and whether you think it was happy?
That was one of the questions I did hear. I'm sorry for this elaborate system of this gentleman having to repeat, because as I'm getting older, I don't hear so well. But I heard that. Would I comment upon Virginia Woolf's marriage? Yes, I'm very glad to, because it has been put about by some scholars, not only in my country but over here, that Leonard was in fact unkind to Virginia and discouraged her, was jealous of her, didn't care for her, might, some person even said, have driven her to suicide. It's totally untrue. And let me tell you a story to illustrate that. I was, as a boy, of course, taken to their little house in the country by my mother, and there were only 4 other people there: Leonard, Virginia, and Maynard Keynes, and his wife, Lydia Lopakova, the ballerina. And I forget what the talk was about, but it grew very animated. And Virginia was standing up by the fireplace in this little room, talking very excitedly. And I saw Leonard rise slowly from his chair and touch her on the shoulder. And without inquiry or reproach of any kind, she went with him out of the room and upstairs. And they returned together in about a quarter of an hour. Now, of course, my mother and the other 2 there knew exactly what had happened. Leonard had seen in her animation danger signals that she might overstep the bounds of sanity again, and had taken her away to calm down and recover. Well, when I think of that incident and the almost biblical tenderness with which he touched her on the shoulder, and her instant submissiveness to him, a submissiveness that she would never have accorded to any other person, then I think, I wish that these critics who said that he ill-treated her could have been there with me.
Maybe 1 or 2 more?
I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have read your father's diary, so I hope they don't mind if I ask you to comment on your recollections and memories of him rather than Virginia Woolf.
Your recollections and memories of your father. He's interested.
About my father's diaries?
Yes.
Were you asking about my father's diaries?
Well, I've read them and I'm a fan of them. I mentioned to someone today when I was coming here that 2,000 years from now, when people want to get a glimpse of interwar and post-war Europe, that could be one of the half-dozen things they read.
Yeah.
So,
I didn't quite get the question at the end.
He would actually just like you to comment about your father, about his writing, and about
his diaries in particular. He kept a diary all his life. And when he entered public life, because he was in the House of Commons with Churchill and intimate of Churchill's all through the war period, his diary, of course, has become one of very great importance and significance historically. But it was also a diary which was very human. And it's a mixture of his private and his public life, his reflections upon the books he read and the people he met and so on. Exactly the diary which Virginia Woolf encouraged me to keep, and which indeed I've tried to keep myself. And my father's diaries, which I published in 3 volumes, in the, what was it, the 70s, the 60s, the 1960s, of course, is only a 20th part of the whole. The entire diary is 3 million words long, and the original of it is now at Oxford in one of the college libraries there. I think it's one of the best diaries, the most interesting, informative, and amusing diaries of the last century.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Sure. Okay. I'm now interested in the diaries, in that part of Harold Nicholson's diary that hasn't been published. And I wonder, it seems to me what's interesting about what you've written about your mother and father, that we do get a sense of your mother's intimate life, if you like. But I've never been able to get a sense of Harold Nicholson's intimate life, of your father's, and intrigued by that, and the different people we know in that sense. And do the unpublished diaries tell us more about that?
This woman is wondering about the unpublished portions of the diaries, whether they reveal a little bit more about the intimate life of your father.
Well, of course, there were passages which I did not publish, owing for reasons of discretion. But there were others which were less interesting, as in everybody's diaries. The times of trains, the minor illnesses and things like that, or long accounts of committee meetings, which have ceased to have a great deal of importance now. So I left all those out. I mean, when I was only doing 1/20th of the whole, there had to be. I don't think that if anybody were to go through it, unless they had a very special reason, like writing the biography of somebody whom my father knew, they would find much more of interest than I published myself. But, of course, people whose feelings I was saving by not publishing things about them have now died in many, many cases. And so if I was really unkind, I would publish a supplement.
Well, at this point, let me invite you to visit with Mr. Nicholson individually up here. We'll have an opportunity to have some books signed. Dr. Newland did sign all our copies of Leonardo da Vinci before he left today, so we do have those in the back of the room. And please join me again in thanking Mr. Nicholson.